Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. On the 25th of March, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi landed up in New Delhi. A visit unannounced by either side. It was the first visit by a senior Chinese official after a long hiatus of 2.5 years. Wang Yi's recent visit to India must be understood and analyzed with regard to three pertinent issues. One is the military standoff along the line of actual control, now entering its third year. Two, the nature of India-China trade relations after the COVID-19 pandemic. And three, the tough choices that lie ahead for Beijing and New Delhi in the larger geopolitical context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let's take a look at the ongoing crisis along the LAC. There have been 15 rounds of discussions since the military standoff began in the summer of 2020. Referred to as the disengagement talks, the Indian Army to PLA conversations have brought limited success. The standoff still continues in several areas. Moving on to trade relations between the two countries. India-China bilateral trade has grown by 44% in 2021 after a downturn in 2020 due to the pandemic. India's imports from China rose to $97.5 billion in 2021, up 46.1% from imports worth $66.7 billion in 2020. The spike in bilateral trade has also increased India's trade deficit with China, which was $69.4 billion in 2021, up from $45.9 billion in 2020 and $56.8 billion in 2019. For all the talk of Atmanirbhar Bharat and building supply chain resilience, India remains economically tethered to China. Finally, the Russian invasion has placed both China and India in a geopolitically awkward position. For China, the invasion came immediately after Presidents Putin and Xi met on the sidelines of the Winter Olympics and declared that there were no limits to the strategic partnership between Russia and China. On the other hand, India remains firmly dependent on Russia for the bulk of its defense supplies. Interestingly, both India and China abstained from the UN voting against Russia, although for very different reasons. For India, one of the primary reasons for not condemning Russia is Chinese belligerence in the region. India is worried that the Ukraine war will increase China's stocks globally. For China, its refusal to condemn Russia is its desire to see a weakening US-led world order. Beijing is also absorbing real-time strategic lessons in Taiwan. New Delhi has been closely monitoring Wang Yi's long and winding road to and from New Delhi. Before arriving in India, Wang Yi addressed the Organization of Islamic Cooperation meeting in Islamabad, where he said, quote unquote, "On Kashmir, we have heard again today the calls of many of our Islamic friends, and China shares the same hope." It isn't surprising that India didn't take too kindly to Yi's statement at the OIC meeting in Islamabad. MEA spokesperson Arindam Bakshi responded by saying that, and I quote, "Nations and governments that associate themselves with such exercises should realize the impact it has on their reputation," unquote. Yi visited Pakistan and Afghanistan before arriving in New Delhi and went to Nepal from India. It clearly shows China's solid regional outreach and the low priority that China gives to its diplomatic relations with India. China's regional policy has been making headways in India's traditional sphere of primacy in South Asia. Under the Belt and Road Initiative, China is driving infrastructure development in almost all of India's South Asian neighbors except perhaps Bhutan. The Chinese footprint in Afghanistan has also been steadily increasing. While the international community has been glued to the developments in Ukraine, China has been focusing on South Asia. So, why are the two sides engaging each other at all? Personally, I think the primary focus of Wang Yi's visit was to gauge whether bilateral ties remained unchanged despite the 2020 aggression and the capture of territory by the People's Liberation Army. India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar made it immediately clear that New Delhi was not keen on such an outcome. Soon after his meeting with Wang Yi, the EAM Jaishankar said, and I quote, "If you ask me, is our relationship normal today? My answer to you is no, it is not. And it cannot be normal if the situation in the border areas is abnormal. And surely the presence of a large number of troops here in contravention of agreements is an abnormality," unquote. This is a very strong statement of intent coming out of New Delhi. The second major rationale for Wang Yi's visit, I think, is the deeper desire in Beijing to wean India away from the West at a time when India is facing stringent criticism in the US and the West for standing by Russia. However, such an outcome seems highly unlikely. The third major rationale is to ensure that Prime Minister Modi attends the in-person BRICS summit in China later this year, attended by Russian President Vladimir Putin as well. Alongside the BRICS summit, it may also hold a meeting of the RIC leadership. Finally, through Wang Yi's visit to New Delhi, China wants to send a message to those in the region and those outside of it that it is seeking a realignment of the regional order while there are struggles to reshape the global order. China, in a way, is looking to take charge of the region. For India, the larger picture is clear. Trade must continue for the country's post-COVID economic recovery, and for that, China is crucial. More so, because of the Ukraine war, energy prices have spiked, leading to retail price inflation in India. So, India cannot let differences with China get in the way of its bilateral trade. India realizes it has no option but to engage China simply because the two sides share a common geography. So, what should we expect for India-China relations going forward? While the decision is still pending whether Prime Minister Modi will attend the BRICS summit scheduled for later this year in China, India is likely to engage China in all other forums. At the BRICS meeting to be held tentatively in September, India, China as well as Russia will come face to face with each other. A potential RIC meeting, RIC meeting, could also take place, the date for which remains unannounced. Then there is the 17th G20 Heads of State and Government Summit that will take place in October 2022 in Bali, Indonesia, where both India and China will be present. And the 2023 G20 meeting will be held in New Delhi. It will be interesting to see if the Western Bloc boycotts the G20 meetings due to the Russian presence. If the Western states boycott G20, it will be tough for New Delhi to either attend the Bali G20 meeting or hold the G20 summit in New Delhi in 2023. In the meantime, however, Indian officials and strategists believe that China will try to cut India out of regional security discussions like the ones on Afghanistan that held in China recently. There is no clarity in New Delhi on whether NSC Ajit Doval will accept Wang Yi's invitation to visit China for the special representative talks on the border. While China appears to think that the post-2020 border disengagement talks are a subset of the larger boundary issue, New Delhi views it very differently, and rightly so. For the Modi government, the vacation of territory captured in 2020 must happen before the larger boundary talks can go anywhere. Well, that was my take. To discuss Wang Yi's visit in greater detail, I have with me Dr. Jabin Jacob. He is an associate professor at the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at the Shivanatha University. So, welcome to the National Security Conversation, Dr. Jabin Jacob.
Thank you, Happy. Good to be here.
Jabin, how do you view the recent visit of the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi to India, given the backdrop of this 2-year military standoff along the line of actual control and the sort of geopolitics of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? I mean, remember, the visit was not announced by the two sides. It was kept, some kind of a secret. So it sounded as if it was, something that both sides didn't want to speak about, but happened anyways.
So, frankly, I was surprised that the visit took place at all. Visits like these don't take place or shouldn't take place without some prior discussion of outcomes, and at least in the India-China case, that we know that there is a major issue outstanding between the two countries in terms of the transgressions that the Chinese were involved in 2020. And despite several rounds of talks, military to military, as well as at the diplomatic level, nothing has progressed. So to actually host a Chinese foreign minister at a time when we have no substantial output on the scene, as well as in the context of this particular crisis, makes it look like the India-China issue on the LAC is not as important as other issues that the world is facing. So in terms of optics, I think it looked very bad as far as the Indians were concerned. And to my mind, I think we missed several tricks by allowing this visit. In terms of your question about the Russia-Ukraine context, no, that is, of course, what the Chinese were aiming at. They wanted to give the impression that somehow India, because it has not aligned itself completely with the Americans or the West on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is therefore against the West. Now, that is not our position. Our position is far more nuanced than that. And while on the surface, it might look like India and China are on the same page, it's nothing of the sort. And I think the foreign minister, S. Jaishankar, made that very clear in his remarks to the press after the meeting. But, that's kind of like bolting the stable, closing the barn doors after the horse is bolted. So that's a nuance that only Indian media will maybe pick up. But the rest of the world, and this is where the Chinese scored, the rest of the world look at India and China, the foreign ministers meeting, they're only going to read the headlines. And the Chinese obviously have a much better capacity of selling these things than Indians do. So I think it looks very bad for us overall.
That's a very important point that you're making, Jabin. You're saying that this was probably aimed at placating the international community, as if from the Chinese side, to tell the world that things are probably normal, even though things are probably not normal between the two sides. You refer to Jaishankar's press conference thereafter, in which he said, our relations with China is not normal given the presence of a large number of troops in contravention of the 93-96 agreements. He also noted that we still have ongoing friction areas, and our discussions today was to take that forward. After 15 rounds of talks, are we any closer to resolving the military standoff and restoration of the status quo ante? What is your assessment of what's happening on the LAC and what the Chinese strategy is, apart from, of course, the optics of placating the international community that they want to sort of, resolve issues with India?
So you mentioned status quo ante, and if you look closely, the Indian government has stopped talking about the restoration of status quo ante in many ways. To say that the relationship is not a normal relationship, I think is stating the obvious. It doesn't really indicate the direction in which the relationship is going. And I think that is really a problem, because if the foreign minister of the country, if the government of the day cannot tell us where it sees India-China relations to be, what the future looks like, then we have a problem on our hands. So I think that's not enough for us to go on. It looks like perhaps the way the trend has been, we will have gradual, very long drawn out negotiations to achieve some gradual aims, which is, pulling back of troops from certain points, which is something that we've seen since February of last year, right? First from Pangong So and then so on, one by one at different areas. But what this means is that we eventually forget the larger problem. We seem to we seem to be happy enough with what is now being interpreted as progress of the Chinese troops vacating one small patrolling point or an area, which is of course important in the larger scheme of things, but that's not the full picture. We need them to step back from a whole frontage in Ladakh, which is not happening. Plus, there's this talk of legacy issues at Depsang and so on, which again, I think, to my mind, suggests that the government really doesn't have a plan of action as far as an eventual resolution of the boundary dispute. The Indian diplomatic corps has been saying that we are only talking about restoration of status quo ante and prior to April 2020, which is to say that they are not looking at this current conflict as an opportunity to try something bigger. So not only have we seen that the Chinese set the terms of this conflict, they had the initiative, they engaged in the violations, the transgressions, and now they seem also to be determining the pace of the negotiations and also the outcome of those negotiations. What is it that India is doing proactively? There doesn't seem to be any evidence of India trying something proactive, with the exception, of course, of our occupation of the Kailash Ranges at the end of August in 2020. But that's also something that we quickly gave up on the negotiating table. So how is it that we are in charge of setting the pace, or in terms of declaring what it is that we want to achieve?
Jabin, that's an important point. I mean, you are making an argument, a strong argument. You are saying that the government has not really articulated what is the state of play between India and China on the line of actual control. I mean, Jayashankar's statement that our relations are not normal is probably not good enough. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that is what I'm saying, because this is too important a relationship. And I think we seem to get pulled in different directions, or seem to privilege other relationships. I mean, if you look at our response post Pulwama, that's of a different order entirely compared to this. Now we could say that, all right, China is a different order of an adversary. We have different issues to consider, a lack of resources perhaps. But I think it also speaks to a certain lack of understanding of Chinese intentions and what the Chinese might do in terms of how we respond. And I've argued this before, that the only way to respond to this Chinese transgression is punitively. The fact that the Chinese engage in transgressions in the first place means, already indicates a certain number of things: that they do not care for Indian interests, that they are intent on ensuring that India knows its place in the South Asian region, and that they see India merely as a country not with any agency of its own, but as an appendage of the West/America and so on. So this, of course, simplifies the narrative for the Chinese, right? Because then it shows that the Chinese are in putative conflict with the Americans, and everybody else is sort of ranged in either of these camps. So this is not helpful for India. If we do not, this comes from us not being proactive in terms of our responses to the Chinese. And why do you think AUKUS happened? This is another way of saying that, well, India is not pulling its weight in the cord, and so the Americans have gone ahead and done something else.
Let's come to that. I mean, Jabin, my own reading is that the Chinese wanted to probably get the Indians to accept the current state of play as business as usual, and then go back to, the current state of play as the reality on the ground, and let's move on with business as usual. I think that's what Wang Yi was probably trying to do. The Indian statement that things are not normal on the line of actual control is perhaps a subtle pushback to that. Now, you seem to be arguing that's probably not good enough, given the overbearance that the Chinese have shown and will probably continue to show. If you were advising the government of India, what are some of the things that you would tell them in terms of how to react to the Chinese aggression, as it were?
So I will repeat myself. I think a punitive response remains important. And while people might argue that, well, this is irresponsible talk, this is escalatory and so on, I think both sides, if you look at the doctrines on both sides, the Chinese certainly have always talked about a limited war under high-tech conditions. They are in no way better placed than us in prosecuting a longer duration conflict, or a conventional extended conflict. They also have other concerns to think about, their eastern seaboard and so on. Plus, to come back to the Russia-Ukraine question, if you look at the performance of the Russians, remember, the Chinese PLA is an army that has picked up a great deal from the Soviet model of military. And these are things that now the Chinese will have to look at. I mean, if you look at what happened at Galwan, if you look at what happened at Doklam, remember the Indians pushed back. Yes, we suffered more casualties, but the fact is, or at least right now, the evidence says that we suffered more casualties. But the thing is, we did push back, and the Chinese stopped. So it means that the Chinese have to, and after what has happened with the Russian troops and their progression of their conflict in Ukraine, the Chinese might need to go back to the drawing board and say, look, things do not always work out as planned. Now, you could very well say that to me, that, well, if India starts a punitive strike, but we are responding with reason. We did not start this conflict. And the longer we wait, unfortunately, that only means that China salami-slicing becomes permanent. We see that happen, what has happened in the South China Sea. At some point, even for diplomatic capital, we need to be able to respond more adequately than we have so far. If China also needs to be deterred in other theaters. And so I think just talking is not good enough. Or if we talk, at least in the military talks, don't go wishy-washy. One day, one round of talks ends up with a joint statement. The next one will again end up with joint statements. And then we have a sort of falling out as we had at the 13th round. 14th and 15th round are immediately followed by joint statements. I mean, what the logic is escapes me.
Right.
You either have a clear position or you don't.
Right. I get it. I mean, let's sort of try and also understand the big picture here, Jabin. Yi's visit to Delhi was not an exclusive one, really. I mean, first he went to Islamabad, then he went to Kabul, then he came here for half a day, then he went to Nepal, I think, for 2 days. So this was probably China, when the world is focused elsewhere, trying to visit South Asia and consolidate the region, or as you put it rightly in the beginning, send that message to the rest of the international community that, hey, we are taking sort of care of the region, and this region is sort of under our leadership, etc. Is that the kind of message you think the Chinese were trying to send to India and to the rest of the international community by undertaking this particular visit to the region? Also, remember that the Chinese held a regional foreign ministers meeting in Afghanistan, but did not invite Jaishankar while he was here.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that this is a message that the Chinese want to send to the rest of the world. But if they wanted to send this message to India, clearly India didn't understand the message, because that's why India invited or allowed the visit to go. Remember, we were once upon a time very prickly about the Chinese visiting us.
That's why India invited what? India didn't get the message.
Which is why India allowed the visit to happen. Clearly the Chinese, because, I mean, if you remember, the Indians were once upon a time very prickly about the fact that the Chinese foreign minister or the president would be visiting us after a visit to Islamabad, right? Or would go from India to another. So making it look like India was just one South Asian country. So from that, we have accepted a normal situation where the Chinese foreign minister goes around all these countries and visits Delhi.
Would you then say, Jabin, that the Indian side should have declined a visit of the Chinese foreign minister to India in the manner in which it unfolded? Is that your argument?
I would say yes. I have actually said that instead of actually, and there was provocation too. What the Chinese foreign minister said at the OIC conference in Islamabad on Kashmir should have been grounds enough to say that, well, I'm sorry, but now the visit will not happen now, or at least postpone the visit. I mean, we have made a big hue and cry about the CPEC project passing through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And, where if that is a position that we have taken on that particular issue, then we need to be consistent.
Had it been any other country, India would have reacted quite aggressively to that. But when it comes to China, we seem to be going a little easy. We seem to be going, slow in sort of responding adequately to the Chinese. Where is that coming from? Is that because we don't want to take the Chinese bull by the horns? What do you think are the sources of this reluctance, as it were?
So I wouldn't, like to think that this is a position across the government. I'm sure wise people within the government understand the implications of what we are doing. But perhaps we overestimate the Chinese capacities at this point in time and underestimate our own capacities. And we don't want to rock the boat for multiple reasons, domestic reasons, perhaps external reasons. Frankly, it beats me. For me, from my perspective, I think if we were to focus sharply and clearly on China and respond like for like to China, that would also resolve a lot of our other questions. I mean, other questions that our neighbors have about our will, about our ambitions, our global ambitions, because we are not going to be able to, seek number one in the region or number one in the world without adequately responding to China. And as long as that is the case, people will perceive India as, the fact that India is being perceived so negatively over the Russia question is also precisely because India is not able to respond adequately to China. If we had done adequately to China, perhaps the world would look at much more carefully on our Russia position or on our Ukraine position.
Interesting. Jabin, what is your, look at some of the other issues. What is your understanding of China's take on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, given that it came within weeks of the Xi-Putin meeting on the sidelines of the Winter Olympics, where the two men actually declared that there were no limits to their strategic partnership? How do you China, it's not as if China is really standing solidly behind Russia either. So what's going on here?
Look, there are at least two issues here. One, China is not a normal state in the way that we understand a state in the international relations. This is a party state. And here, the first objective of the party, the Communist Party, is its own survival. So what we have really is regime interest over national interest. You think of something like Wolf Warrior diplomacy. It is not in the business of any diplomat to make the kind of statements that Chinese diplomats have been making in different world capitals, right? But if you look at it from, preservation of party interests or preserving their own position at home, this makes absolute sense. So that's one part, regime survival. The second is the Communist Party has a deeply ideological worldview. It's a Manichaean approach. It's a black and white approach on which they are in conflict with the democratic order in the West. So from this perspective, the Chinese need to stand with the Russians because Russia is seen as an important bulwark against the West. So there's no question of the Chinese stepping back from supporting Russians. And if you ask me, at least some chatter on this indicates that at least Xi Jinping knew, Putin was up to this, and Putin would have informed. And they have called each other best friends. They've celebrated each other's birthdays and things like that. So it's not like this was not something that the Chinese didn't know about.
But are the Chinese really supporting Russians? I don't really see that. They haven't even voted against the resolution that was brought to condemn the Russian aggression. They actually abstained. So, in many ways, you're probably looking at China and India pretty much on the same side in some ways when it comes to Russia. So where is Russia? Where is China supporting Russia at all?
No, it's again, there are differences between the Indian and Chinese position. And the Chinese position is, look, because it has this a sense of self as a putative global number one. Now, as much as it would like the Russians to stand together with the Russians against the Americans, it's not as if they want the Russians to steal their thunder. Look, the Russians say something and they do it. Whereas if you look at how the Chinese have been talking about Taiwan, reunification, etc., there's a lot of talk, but seldom any action on this. And this is an issue that is almost directly similar in terms of cultural connections, blood ties, and so on. So I don't think that the Chinese also want the Russians to feel like they can rely on the Chinese to pull the Russian chestnuts out of the fire. The Chinese are also trying to say, like, we also have our own positions. We believe in sovereignty and respect for territorial integrity and so on. Because if the Russian logic applies to China, then the Mongols in China, the Kazakhs in China, and so on will all say, look, we have countries of our own otherwise. And if these countries had any sort of capacity, they are also going to make the same argument the Russians made. So the Chinese also don't want to encourage that kind of behavior in which it has implications also for Chinese domestic politics. So as long as that is the case, the Chinese will not throw their hat fully in with the Russians.
Interesting. The question that's on everyone's mind, Jabin, these days is, what are the lessons that China is learning from the Russian invasion of Ukraine? What do you think are some of the lessons they're learning, if at all any?
So definitely they are learning lessons. I mean, if anybody learned any lessons from the fall of the Soviet Union, it's the Chinese. And look, they managed to keep the Communist Party alive for another 30 years, right? So the Chinese are definitely watching. They're watching in terms of, I mean, they see this as an opportunity for, economic sanctions against the Russians. The Chinese have said this is not good, etc. But look, they are stepping into the breach. In terms of currency transactions, financial transactions, alternatives provided to the Russians. So there are economic gains for the Chinese. They are learning from the Russian military approach. I mean, the Chinese have learned from the American Gulf War experiences in Iraq, both the Gulf Wars and so on. So this is another experience that the Chinese have to learn from military, both the employment of military technology, the military tactics, urban warfare, and so on and so forth, right? They're learning from it from a political perspective, as in, what does this mean about Putin staying power, right? What happens to authoritarian rule under conditions of stress, such as invasion of another country, domestic opposition, and a lot of Russians are vocal about the opposition. How do the Russian side deal with opposition, and how do you maintain your own image while dealing with opposition? So there's any number of lessons that the Chinese will pick up from this experience.
Would I be right in saying that one of the lessons that the Chinese may have learned, and I'm not so sure about it, you are the expert here, may have learned, is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was not taken lightly by the West and the United States of America. They have pushed back and pushed back hard. And Putin is actually struggling because he didn't probably expect this pushback, and he probably expected a quick victory. So one of the Chinese lessons may be that it's not easy to flex our muscles in South China Sea vis-a-vis Taiwan or some of the other things that they have in their mind, or even perhaps vis-a-vis India. Or am I stretching the argument? Is that a lesson that the Chinese have learned?
No, I think there's certainly a point there. But it also means, certainly, the Chinese would have realized that there are some red lines you simply cannot cross just yet, right? Not with the kind of capacities that you have, or even with the kind of capacities that you have. But then it reinforces another lesson or foreign policy strategy that the Chinese have employed for a very long time, which is of salami-slicing, right? Which is that they do these steps incrementally over time, and the provocation is never large enough to provoke a conventional conflict reaction or economic sanctions or anything of the sort. Now, the Americans are finally wisened up. They, by naming China a strategic competitor, by launching the trade war, etc., they have sort of begun to deal with this salami slicing or under the envelope kind of activities that the Chinese have engaged in. But this is again problematic, because then it only says that there is a set of activities or a kind of activity that the Chinese can engage in which will not bother the rest of the world. And I think it's time to send a message clearly that some things are simply not done. It's not the scale of the activity, but even threatening, even salami slicing, it's simply not acceptable. And that's where I come back to the India question, which is India's response to the transgressions of 2020 have proven inadequate. It only encourages and emboldens the Chinese in South Asia, with India certainly, but also with the rest of South Asia.
Right. Jabin, there have been some speculations about China wanting Prime Minister Modi to attend the BRICS summit scheduled later in the year. Given where China-India relations are today, do you think there's a possibility that Mr. Modi will travel to China to attend the BRICS summit?
Oh my God, that's a horribly bad idea. And I think the NSA, Mr. Doval was quite right. As reported in the press, there was no statement from his office itself that that visit will have to wait until issues on the LAC are resolved. Now, my worry is, what does this mean? What does resolution mean? Is resolution meaning just, some temporary pullback or from certain points, or full restoration of status quo ante? So that really is a concern. But my sense is that this visit will very likely not happen. the Prime Minister might send a representative, but I think that is just as bad. Frankly, I think the BRICS is a completely moribund sort of grouping. It doesn't really make sense. A mix of democracies and authoritarian states, a mix of 4 economies that aren't doing well, with one economy that is, the outright leader. What pulls them together? And it's just bad optics.
Let me put it this way. I mean, given the fact that Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi haven't spoken to each other ever since the standoff took place in 2020, in the summer of 2020, will this, if indeed Mr. Modi travels to China, will this provide an opportunity for the two sides to sit together at the apex level and perhaps even go back to status quo ante? Or you don't think that's going to happen?
Well, first of all, let's assess what 18 visits or meetings between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi have achieved. We've had Doklam, we've had Galwan, and in between, remember, we also had the informal summits, which were supposed to be some sort of a breakthrough innovation in Indian diplomacy with China. And we got 6 months after the Mamallapuram summit, we had, Galwan. So I don't think this works. We first of all have to understand what is our policy with respect to China? What is our understanding of Chinese intentions? What do you think the Chinese want with us? And I've just explained, the worldview of the Chinese does not brook competition from the Indians. They don't see the Indians with the kind of agency, despite whatever statements and claims that India has strategic autonomy and so on. I don't think the Chinese actually believe any of that rhetoric. They see the Indians as subservient to the Americans. And we are not in a position to, unless we change that narrative or impression, we are not going to be able to achieve anything with while meeting the Chinese.
So you would say that Mr. Modi should not travel to China to attend the BRICS summit?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
He should not be traveling.
Okay. Later this year, we're going to witness the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. Will we see a new leader of the Chinese Communist Party, or Xi Jinping's reign continue? What implications will it have for the Chinese foreign policy and for Sino-Indian relations?
I think it's very likely that Xi Jinping will continue for a 3rd term as General Secretary of the Communist Party. I don't think it massively changes anything in terms of Chinese foreign policy or India-China relations. And the implications really are domestic. That's what we need to pay attention to. What will be the composition of the Politburo Standing Committee? What will be the thrust on personality politics? What will be the new economic policies that the Chinese will adopt at home? I think currently there's an overbearing weight of politics on economic decision and decision making. And that has led to sort of flux and instability in the Chinese economy, which has not really played out well overall for, the pandemic has covered up a lot of those issues, but the Chinese economy is not doing as well as people think it is, or even the Chinese wish it to be. So all of those decisions, are of much more interest as far as I'm concerned, when Xi Jinping becomes General Secretary for the 3rd term, or if he becomes General Secretary for the 3rd term.
Right. Jabin, here is my last question. Is Xi the problem between India and China, or is China the problem between India and China? Or rather, is it a structural problem? He's a rising superpower trying to sort of show other powers in its neighborhood their place? Or is it about personality? Is it about domestic politics? What is the problem?
No, I think there is a structural problem. But even in a structural problem, I think the nature of states, if you're a normal state in international relations, states will come to a sort of an understanding. Nobody wants to bomb the hell out of each other under normal circumstances. But if the conflict is ideological, when you perceive a threat from a rival or an alternative political system to your own regime's survival, then I think we are out of the realm of normal international politics. None of our theories of IR can actually explain this. We'll take care of this. So I think there's both the structural fact of India and China being two large powers. So there's a natural element of competition, but that would have been manageable. But if you have a political party in power that says, we can only survive by undermining the opposing political system rather than dealing with it as a state-to-state basis, then we have a problem on our hands. So I suppose it's not so much personality. I mean, the Communist Party also has, one of those lessons that the Communist Party learned from the fall of the Soviet Union is that, you got to stand together. You got to stand behind, and regime survival needs much greater attention and energy than we've given it so far. And that's really what is going on in China at the moment.
Right. So you're saying China is not the problem, Xi is not the problem, it's the Chinese Communist Party that's a problem.
Yeah, I suppose you could put it that way. It sort of simplifies things. Things are, that's far more simplistic than I would want to put it, because there are elements within the Communist Party that can also think rationally and differently on different aspects of international relations. But there is this trend at the moment which is dominant, which I think is problematic.
Jabin, fascinating conversation, great insights, very thoughtful, very forthright. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you, Happy, for having me. Pleasure always.
Get a sneak peek of exclusive content before everyone else for channel members only. Memberships start at ₹89. Hit the join button below.